What we need to do today is to extend our discussion of factor markets and to look at each of the specific types of factors of production. Remember, we're talking about land, labor, and capital. So we're going to start with labor because that's what you and I are. That's what we're all about. And labor is unique as far as a factor of production is concerned because we are dealing with people. You know, I know it sounds harsh to think of labor as a factor of production, as an input like anything else, but it is. And so when we talk about labor, one of the truly important things about labor that we have to look at is the fact of labor unions. When we talk about unions, we have to realize that there are several different types of unions. The first is a craft union. This is a union made up of people who all do the same job. So, for example, the plumbers union, the electrical workers union, these are all craft unions. And most of the early unions or organizations that we think of as unions were craft unions. The next type of union that we have are industrial unions. And these came into play when industry first started. An industrial union is a union made up of people who all do the same work, or actually work for the same company, but don't necessarily do the same job. An example of an industrial union are the United Auto Workers. If you work in an auto assembly plant, you probably belong to the UAW. Whether you put the tires on the car, or the windshield in the car, or you paint the car, whatever. If you would assemble a car, you belong to the UAW. So when I think most of us think of labor unions, we're probably thinking of a craft union or an industrial union. But there's one other union that has to be separated out because of its unique place in our economy. In a way, it is an industrial union. It's public employee unions. Public employee unions are people who work for the government, whether it's local, county, state, or federal. If they belong to a union, it's a public employee union. The American Federation of Teachers, if they're K through 12, are public employee unions. The Firemen's Union, the police union, those are all public employee unions. Now, public employee unions are separated out because they do not have the right to strike, which is the probably biggest weapon that the craft and industrial unions have. Public employee unions cannot legally strike. That doesn't mean that they don't strike, because we've all heard of excuse me, we've all heard of teachers' strikes and things like that, but they can't legally strike. So if a teachers' union goes out on strike, they risk losing their jobs. They risk a lot of things. There is another type of union. Well, it's not really a union. We categorize it as a union, but it's not. What we're talking about here are professional associations. These are associations like the Bar Association, the Association of Certified Public Accountants, the Nurses Association. They are not unions, but they get lumped in here because in certain ways they act like unions. And by act like unions, I mean they lobby for needs of their members. So in a way, they act like a labor union. If we look back in history, we can see in the Middle Ages there was things called guilds. Guilds were basically craft unions of the Middle Ages. As feudalism collapsed and as we moved into capitalism, one of the characteristics that allowed us to move from feudalism to capitalism was what we called the creation of a free labor force. By a free labor force, we didn't mean that people didn't get paid. They were free of any obligations. They were free to find a job. They were free to go wherever they wanted. And so the guilds were actually a reaction to the fact that more and more workers were being thrown off their land. Most people had been peasants before, and they were farmers. And now the people who had crafts, who had skills, the coopers, the bakers, the silversmiths, the blacksmiths, they were now seeing people who had been farmers before looking for jobs, non-farm jobs. And so they were facing competition. And the guilds were a way for all of the bakers in the area to come together, form an organization, and try to set restrictions on people entering the field. Now, they couldn't stop you from being a baker, but they could say that only guild members, we oversee their baking. All guild bakers agree to use just the freshest ingredients. And if you had a problem with a guild baker, you could go to the Bakers Guild and lodge a complaint so that there was some type of oversight. What this did was to make it so that somebody who wanted to enter, it became hard to set up a bakery. If you didn't belong to the guild, it was almost impossible for you to set up your own bakery. If you wanted to get into the guild, you certainly could. There were apprenticeship systems and things like that in which you taught young people to get into the craft. But the early guilds were really a way of, one, ensuring a certain amount of quality of products, but also limiting the number of people who were in the industry. When the Europeans started to come to North America, they brought with them their guild system. If you look back in history at the quote-unquote founding fathers, those that were not lawyers or farmers, people like Benjamin Franklin or Paul Revere, both of them were guild members. Paul Revere was a silversmith. He belonged to the Silversmiths Guild. Benjamin Franklin belonged to the Printers Guild. All right. So we brought, as the Europeans came to North America, they brought their guild system. It would be a while until we started seeing things that looked like labor unions really coming into American society. Specifically, it wouldn't be until 1869 that we would get something called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were an organization which basically started out as a, I guess you can call it a social organization. But what it was a group of people who got together. Now, let's take a step back. First, 1869 is just 4 years after the American Civil War. And the country was still trying to move past the Civil War and the implications of the Civil War. Specifically, there were major changes in society. For white middle and upper class women, it was socially unacceptable for them to work. Problem was, their husbands, their fathers, their sons had been killed in the war. And unless they had a male relative who was willing to take them in and provide for them, they had to go to work. Now, this was a problem. There were no social programs, so you relied on your family or you were in trouble. So we were seeing a lot of women, white women, having to go to work. This is when women became teachers and nurses. And this lack of social programs, of any kind of social safety net, was a real problem. The other problem that we were seeing in society was, how do poor people bury their loved ones? Soldiers came back from the war remembering battlefields strewn with bodies that could have laid there for days, and wasn't a pretty thought. So the Knights of Labor were really established to do two things. One, to provide a social network, a social safety net, but also to provide for burial costs, especially in urban areas where people had to rely on houses of worship to bury, to have a place to bury people. It was hard for the working class to deal with these issues. So the Knights of Labor was created as a club of sorts. They had secret handshakes and they had clubhouses and things like that. But you paid dues, and those dues went into a central treasury. And you knew, if you were the male breadwinner of the house, if you were to die or to become injured, your family would get a pension from the Knights of Labor. Or if you were to die, your family could get burial benefits. So they could buy a place, a plot to bury you in, or at least get money to take you back to the country to bury you in. So the Knights of Labor were a very important stepping stone. They were a very important social step towards labor unions. Now, how do they become that important of a step? Well, first of all, you have to realize they went from having, in about 1881, approximately 19,000 members, and in 1886 to having 700,000 members. It was astronomical. And as membership grew, they realized that they were gaining political power, that they could tell their members, hey, this politician or that politician is really pro Knights of Labor. They're really for the things we're for. And so the Knights of Labor were able to begin to have political power. And with this political power, they began to act as what you and I think a labor union is, negotiating for their people, lobbying for their people. So in our next lecture, we're going to look at a little more, couple quick more historical items, and then get into a few more issues. So let's quickly go over to lecture number 2 on labor unions.